Thanks, Randy, and thanks to Patrick as well for inviting me. It's a real pleasure and honor to deliver the keynote address of the 16th Annual Global Fusion Conference. Um, I'm glad I'm not competing with the main course, but feel free to continue eating, and I'll try to compete with dessert. It's great because the theme of the conference, development and resilience in communication, is a close reflection of my own research trajectory. My work examines social change in resource-constrained environments, often in developing countries, but also marginalized communities in developed countries. The two broad domains that I'm going to examine today are health information systems in a global context, and I'm going to delve a little deeply into the notion of transnational migration in a local context, which is Singapore. Both of which I'm going to put into somewhat overlapping with an interest in gender. This talk broadly positions resilience for marginalized communities within the broader frame of structuration. So I'm going to use Giddens and juxtapose structure and agency, resources and rules, and try to talk about the dialectical struggle that emerges as a consequence of the introduction, usage, and appropriation, in my case, of modern ICTs such as mobile phones. A little bit of a plug. Tomorrow there's a book launch of the latest edited volume. As director of the SIRC, I also lead the Circa 3 program, which examines the impact of research in developing countries, particularly ICT for development. Today I will address the first question posed in this volume about research on impact, which is what is the evidence of the impact of ICTs on society? Tomorrow we'll get a chance to talk a little bit more about the second, which is what's the impact of research on ICTs informing the information society in the developed world. So moving along, the first trajectory I'm going to take is that of mHealth, or mobile healthcare, in developing countries, but it's worthwhile to give you a little bit of the context within which I work. So these are some of the under-resourced environments that I often find myself. This is a remote rural location in Aceh Besar in Indonesia, quite far away from mainstream hospitals and technologies. This is in Nepal. This is both functions as a ward for patients in hospitals, but this also sees dual use as an operating theater at times. And then if you're going to get your blood test done, you get it done in a laboratory like this, which you might not find even in a high school in this country. And finally, you arrive in places in India where you see lines of patients sneaking all the way out the door, where the crush of demand is so high that it often outstrips supply. Well, it's within this sort of challenging environment that arises the potential of mHealth, which is mobiles in the healthcare environment. Unlike the constrained health infrastructure that you saw, mobile phones, and yes, that is a mobile phone, I guarantee you. It looks like any other normal home phone, but there's a SIM card in there. And this is a lady who's walking around in the Nepalese Himalayas, making a phone call. The reason they have this as a community healthcare device is to make sure that nobody runs off with it. Right? So within this context, mobile phones have enabled data collection, disease control, emergency medical response, teleconsultation, message dissemination to communities at large, and all sorts of coordination within the health system. Today, however, I'm going to present findings from the project that Randy mentioned, which was arising out of the tragedy of the 2004 tsunami, the epicenter of which was the Aceh province in the north of Indonesia. This was a natural disaster which killed over 230,000 people. And it was truly international in scale, over a dozen countries. Particularly in Aceh. Aceh was a province which had just been through 20 years of conflict because there was a separatist movement happening over there, so there was very low infrastructure to begin with in terms of hospitals and clinics and medical people. But with the tsunami, all that was destroyed, along with much of the medical staff that they had. It's here that we decided to come up with this mHealth app. I didn't even know that it was an app that we were working on. But the whole idea was, in the absence of any healthcare infrastructure, we needed to be able to get information to these community healthcare workers working in remote villages in the Sumatran jungle. And so here was this Motorola phone, which had Java possibilities. And so we gave these to midwives in 223 villages. We also gave them to midwife coordinators and doctors at the district clinics. And then, of course, the 3 OBGYNs that were there in the capital hospital. Just for context, if you were to look at the per capita OBGYN ratio to compare it to maybe a place like Houston, you would have 10 doctors. And so that was the ability of the healthcare system to meet the demands. Well, here was this mobile phone, and this mobile phone, of course, working like any other phone, it allows you to make calls. So when there's an emergency during childbirth, there's the possibility to pick up the phone, and you'll see an instance of this happening. But that's a fairly reactive system. If you're hundreds of kilometers away, there's very little by way of transportation. You have a childbirth emergency, child is bleeding, there's not very, or rather the mother's bleeding, the midwife doesn't know what to do because she's 17 or 18 and has just joined in, not particularly trained. You can make the call to the doctor, and this worked. We, however, were not so satisfied with this extremely reactive system and thought, well, can we use other capabilities? So with the Java applet, we were able to, rather than send information this way, we inverted it and we sent information the other way, which is the 4 times that the midwives met pregnant women during the trimesters. They sent information through long text SMS, and they sent this back up into the system. What was the impact? Well, I'll just read this out. Here is evidence of positive impact. It was a high-risk delivery. I called Miss A, a fellow midwife. Then I called Miss B, senior midwife. When the baby came out, he didn't cry. He had asphyxia. We thought he was already dead. The blood was all over my mobile phone because I kept holding it. I called an ambulance. The mother was bleeding. Miss A took the baby with her and went to the ambulance. Imagine if I handled that patient alone. Probably both the mother and the baby would have died. And it's at this point that, that we see the real value of this particular project. And you might think that, well, you know, case closed, go collect your Nobel Prize, see you on the way out, fantastic. But we then got into a little bit about what else was going on in this process of social change. And further investigation revealed fairly interesting phenomena. Well, one of the things that we were trying to do is see whether mobile phone usage led to health knowledge, and try to figure out what is the way that this was happening. Was it working through the institutions, the hospitals and clinics, that we were connecting up to these midwives in extremely remote locations, or were peer resources working? Well, here's what we found. In terms of improved health knowledge, as a consequence of the introduction of the mobile phones, the support among peers, which is this group over here that you see, other community healthcare workers working in conjunction with the midwives, influence self-efficacy, the lower part that you see. Whereas access to physicians didn't really work. It improved health knowledge, but it didn't really help the midwives become more efficacious in the community or themselves. The question really is why? Why is this sort of path happening? Why is being able to connect with the doctor not important to the midwives? Why did the structure not work as well as the agency that's happening through peer resources? And we wanted to investigate this a little bit further. And here's what we found, at least when we talked to doctors. Here's what doctors have to say about midwives using phones. Using the phones, sometimes she can lie about things. She lies about the blood pressure measurement because she hasn't done it yet. Or maybe she contacts her boyfriend. Well, as we can see from the comments from physicians sitting in the hospital, midwives were under serious hierarchical control, and they needed to negotiate this agency or appropriation of power that was coming with the midwife. Well, the formal healthcare system and the social system back in the village were both premised on patriarchal rules that were hierarchical in nature. Although mobile phones allowed these midwives to appropriate power from doctors in the hospitals by accessing informed advice through their peer networks or through other information sources available, they did meet resistance from hospital physicians, or once again the structure, casting doubts about their credibility. Things were not much different at the village level. Mobile phones did allow the midwives to act as intermediaries between the villagers and the hospital system. So immediately raised their social status. Village women recognized midwives' connectivity to a hitherto inaccessible knowledge source, the hospital. A villager said, and I quote, "If I contacted the doctor, the call would probably be ignored." By using the midwife's mobile phone, however, the doctor could recognize the number and pick the call up. And suddenly it started striking me and the rest of the team that here we're trying to do this sort of health project, and you've given these mobile phones to the women, expecting that health would work, and as we've seen, yes, the deaths, maternal and infant mortality were reduced. But then there was something else that was going on that was sort of niggling us, and we started to talk. And here's an anecdote which somewhat summarizes what's going on. So, as any good researcher doing research in the field, you want to use participatory activities before you start doing this. So we went in and talked to religious leaders and village leaders, right? So we talked to the mullah from the mosque, and I said this was an extremely conservative Sharia province. So we talked to the leaders and said we're planning to do this program. The attempt is to make sure that you have reduced mortality of children. I said, very good, excellent, I support this. And we're going to give it to these midwives, and they'll get training, and they'll be able to contact hospitals. Super, great. And everything went swimmingly well, amazingly well. And we walked out the door when we were stopped by the following statement. "So when do I get my phone?" And just stopped there and thought for a while. We spent a lot of time working with the religious leader, of course a man, and saying, well, of course you don't get the phone because the midwife gets the phone. And tried to explain to him that somehow childbirth doesn't happen on a 9 to 5 schedule. Children don't make appointments when they're entering the world. This might happen at 4 a.m. and the midwife might need the phone at that point of time, or be called out to a distant village when this is happening. And the guy said, yes, that's all very good, but when she needs it, I'll send it to her. And then you realize that there was really something else going on over here, that there was a resistance within the community to give these phones to the women because they shouldn't have access to what at that point of time was a most valuable resource coming in. And this conversation concluded with the leader telling me, and I'll always remember this, making the statement that how would she know what to do? She's just a woman. And it's quite amazing that we're talking about this in the context of childbirth. That somehow this man would imagine that he had some greater experience about this. Midwives, having got these phones, which despite our best intentions, only later on we realized that we were putting them at risk within the social system. So midwives somehow figured out how to negotiate this newfound autonomy or agency they were getting as a consequence of the introduction of these devices versus the subordination they found in the social structure. And so here I quote, "I used my son's mobile phone. Patients used to ask for the number in case she fell sick in the middle of the night. I let my sons have it." And so here's the deal. These phones were not the family phones or the son's phones or the husband's phones. These were project phones given to them by the government of Indonesia. Yet they were having to legitimize the inequality that they faced within the social system by justifying a lack of ownership, pretending that these were somebody else's phones. When they got calls and they were in public, they wouldn't answer the call till they got into a private space and were able, because they didn't want anybody in the village to see them making the call. What if she's calling her boyfriend? And so they engaged in these strategies of sharing, force sharing. Do you want to use my phone? Please use my phone. And this was the first time a phone was appearing in a village. Not that anybody knew a phone number outside the village to call, but yet they would force them to call anyone on the numbers in the phone. I'm struck by the fact that I had to have a fight with the UNDP principal in Jakarta, who said that we should limit the phone numbers on the mobile phones to only those of the health infrastructure. They should not be able to call their families to tell them that they have to go out at 4 a.m. to deliver a child. And I asked the principal in Jakarta whether the phone that he got from UNDP, he wasn't allowed to call his wife if he was running late in a meeting. And of course, at that point of time, he agreed, and we did get the phones and the funding. So this is some of the stuff that I have to do. I'm going to shift countries to China. This is an example of barefoot doctors from Shanxi province in China, sort of demonstrating the similar sort of struggle of the dialectic. So in China, there's a fairly advanced healthcare information system that's being rolled out pretty much in the urban areas. But this institutionally supported healthcare system really doesn't get out to these rural barefoot doctors. And they're called barefoot because in the Cultural Revolution, they were given a kit bag and sent off to some village from their medical school. And that was it, they didn't even get shoes, so hence the term barefoot doctors. And so these doctors being shut out of the system, and once again in this rather low resource environment of the health infrastructure, turned to their guanxi networks. Now guanxi is what we sort of call in the field social capital. And so mobile phones and QQ, their form of social media, became the networks of healthcare information exchange. However, note that guanxi, once again, is very culturally oriented. It emphasizes historical bonds rather than new relationships. Networks are closed and fixed rather than open. It's difficult to penetrate them. And something called huibao, which is the reciprocity of favor. So there's very clear distinctions between insiders in guanxi and outsiders. And those who are who are not part of the network or who are unable to return these favors are seen as poisoning the well. And so within this cultural context, this physician is trying to get in touch with doctors in urban areas, younger doctors, more technologically savvy doctors, to help them in diagnosis and treatment. And imagine SARS going on. You've never seen it before, but there's a doctor out there who you met once who may be able to tell you this on social media. But within this cultural context of guanxi, it's difficult to imagine what resources this aged, less educated rural doctor with low access to technology and low familiarity will be able to contribute to this type of discussion. So eventually, even within the networks, they get bounced out. Talking about, when I was talking about the discourse, the broader theme of this talk, argue that there is hype and hope embodied in the mHealth discourse. But the discourse needs to shift from this highly techno-optimistic stance to more culturally aware recognition of the challenges that those at the periphery, those marginalized, face against the structure of the formal healthcare system. I do acknowledge that the agency that has been acquired and the appropriation strategies that are involved allow these community healthcare workers to circumvent rules using resources made available by the technology, in this case, the social media. I'm going to shift towards the second domain of research in terms of marginalization, which is transnational migration in Singapore. This image shows Filipina domestic workers enjoying their day off. Singapore, of course, is idealized as a cosmopolitan state designed to embrace diversity and difference. I work there, which is extended to notions of openness and acceptance. In reality, however, like many other places, I've been following some of the discourse that's happening right here in this country, and we've seen some of the issues of migration happening right now in Europe, certainly, where there's a serious crisis on, but also in Australia, Indonesia, and so on. Singapore, the same. There are serious societal fissures between locals and migrants, accentuated by government policies such as inflexible labor laws. A weekly holiday was recently initiated for domestic workers. They could work there for up to a year without a single day off. Recently initiated a weekly holiday. Many employers conveniently ignore this. There's suppression of reproductive rights for these foreign domestic workers. Pregnancy is dealt with by deportation and a fine for the employers, if that gives you some sense of the marginalized world that they live in. Of course, within this stressful migrant environment, the literature has often regarded mobile phones, and this is a theme that happens often, as these mythical empowerment tools. My early research found similar empowerment for these migrant women. The use of mobile phones allowed them to alleviate stress by accessing social support. Here, however, I want to talk a little bit about mobile phones within this dialectical transformation and in power negotiation processes, similar to what we talked about in the mHealth projects. To do so, I'll investigate this proposition within the context of what I call migrant mothering. So, transnational mothers, in this case, domestic workers in Singapore, with children in distant home countries who are taking care of children and the elderly in Singapore, of Singaporeans, have been accused of deviant mothering or abandonment of their key motherhood responsibilities, even though that's what they're there for, to earn incomes, to be able to support their families back home. These foreign domestic workers use the mobile phone as a key tool to resist this narrative of deviance of mothering. As you can see in the quote, because talk to them makes us, our children, when they hear my voice, they will think that I am there. I can feel that they are just by my side, but I'm not with them. We cannot live without the handphone. As seen in this quote, they exhibit or counter this deviance with this intensive method of mothering, what Lecoq terms as phatic communication or endless remembering. However, in avoiding this deviant mother identity with this endless communication, endless remembering, transnational mothers run the risk of constant smothering, and we can see this over here. It's good because I can monitor their everyday life, and she's talking about mobile phones. Even though I'm so far away, the bond is still there, my moral support is always there. If possible, I don't want to cut my communication with them. So every day I ask them where they are. This also translates into commodification of the relationship into material benefits, sending money or airtime every time they have a conversation, surveillance of their children on social media to see who their friends are, and hierarchical communication styles. I argue that this struggle for identity is happening at various levels. Seen here is one of professional identity, where there's the promise of empowerment financially, with that of the assumed role of the intensive mother. Another struggle happens between the perceived empowerment of employment. You are, after all, a foreign national in a country earning money, versus the actual menial nature of the job itself, which is that of a maid. So in a cruel twist of fate, these foreign domestic workers are handed phones by their Singaporean employers to take care of the Singaporean children and constantly take care of them. But their own use of mobile phones to talk to their children back home is curtailed by these very same employers. Often mobile phones are confiscated and only given out to them on the weekend or in the evening. And here's the type of conversation that occurs between the mother and the child. Actually, what is my mama doing there in Singapore? My daughter is curious, and also she does not want her mother to do something that in the public's opinion is not good. So until now, about my status as a maid, my daughter is not aware. And so to maintain the special nature of this mother-child relationship, domestic workers engage in communication strategies involving the suppressing of information. So rather not talking about certain stuff, particularly those that are personal revelations. Madanao calls this as in this accentuated ambivalence, where you're communicating about everything but what you should be communicating about. That's a rather provocative photograph, and the only one that is not taken by me as part of a project. The discourse again around migration is highly sensationalized, with daily news stories around the globe of crises around every corner. Singapore is no different. Against the backdrop of a global economic recession, Singaporeans' attitudes towards migration and migrants have hardened. Finding voice, particularly in this rare, and I say rare because this is the only time, this is the second time it's happened in 40 years in Singapore, a riot caused by the accidental death of a South Asian migrant worker, a male migrant worker in Little India, which led to these fairly violent riots. The resultant, often xenophobic debate focused on the lack of socialization with Singaporeans, their use of alcohol, and when it came to mobile phones, they merely made an appearance for a possible activation mechanism for the riots. Wittebon describes these physical heterotopias, places for social deviants, when he was talking about asylum-seeking migrants in Germany, and that's happening as we speak, as material places and social places which represent exclusion. The physical cultural geographies of Singapore for these migrants, seen in isolated work sites, dormitories which are on the edges of the island, ethnic ghettos such as Little India, where there are no walls or barriers, but they're still blocked over there, mirror these heterotopias of exclusion. I don't want to leave it on such a note, but merely arguing solely for the existence of such a dystopic reality beneath the veneer of a cosmopolitanism created for the Singaporean elites, which includes not only citizens but foreign talent, such as myself, I do find relief in the knowledge that a bounded cosmopolitanism is happening, aided partially by mobile phones for these migrants. There's an optimism and a focus in economic empowerment and the acquisition of technical skills. There is pride and effort in the attainment of language and in skill proficiency. And there's the creation of multiple new relationships, often cutting over national boundaries. Migrants are using mobile phones to negotiate these transnational experiences and transcend limitations of class, race, education, and gender. In conclusion, I argue that modern ICTs provide open, participatory platforms for learning and growth. Mobiles in particular subvert the closed boundaries of restricted spaces, cutting across cultural and physical geographies, allowing communication with a variety of others, providing a wealth of information and economic and social empowerment. I do note, however, that examination of this broader social context behind technology is determined within existing power structures in society. Although there are practices of agency and appropriation by marginalized communities. I conclude, and as is evident from this photograph, the future is bright, it's young, and it's female. Thank you very much.
I think the
I believe you can move to dessert now.
Are there questions or comments, feedback for his talk? Piqued your interest.